Hey, welcome to Kamloops Alliance Church Online. My name is Chris, one of the pastors here at the church. Before we get into anything else, super important programming note for you. Stop what you're doing, stop drinking your coffee, stop eating your waffle, whatever you're doing on your run. Super important programming note, especially for, yes, you online. So this weekend, obviously, Saturday night, 6:30, we are streaming online, 9 and 11 on Sundays, streaming online. Next weekend, Easter Sunday, we're going to be live streaming. And so not what you're receiving right now, which is a pre-recorded message. There's nobody in the room right now. But next weekend, we are streaming live Saturday night, 6:30, and yes, Sunday, 9 and 11 a.m. But the weekend after that, that's April 15th and 16th weekend, really important for you to understand, we are not going to be streaming online anymore a Saturday night service at 6:30 or a Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Why? Why are we doing this? Because we are moving away from this pre-recorded message. We now have the technology, the people, the team, that we're going to be live streaming the sermon on Sunday mornings. And so April 15th and 16th weekend, again, no Saturday night streaming 6:30, no Sunday morning online service at 9 a.m., only Sundays at 11 from April 15th and 16th moving forward, okay? So wanted to prep you for that. You, wherever you are, you play such an important role in our community, so we want to communicate well. If you have any questions, any feedback, please let us know. You can email hello@kac.ca or phone the church office. We want to help you through it, answer any questions. So again, April 15th and 16th, moving away from 6:30 and 9 a.m., 6:30 Saturday and Sunday 9 a.m. from an online service and 11 a.m. only moving forward. Okay. Also, that weekend, April 15th and 16th, don't miss that 11 a.m. service because we're launching a new series called Skeptics Welcome, and we are tackling some really juicy topics. Aren't we better off without religion? It's a good question. Aren't we better off without all of this? Like, do we need this anymore? Talking about how does a good God allow suffering? Pastor Cody is going to be tackling a really tough subject, but a really important one. Isn't Christianity homophobic? All of these really important questions. We want to be a church helping you in the real world. So this is for skeptics who are welcome to our church, but also for you as you try to follow Jesus in our world. And so that's coming up. Want you to know about that so you can invite your friends and be excited for what is to come. Yes, so we are in Palm Sunday, the week that changed the world. So we just looked at the story, which was 6 weeks, six different acts as we look at the storyline of the Bible. We ended last week with the second coming of Jesus, and we are rewinding the clock a little bit and focusing, zooming in on now the last week of Jesus' life. And this is the week that changed the world. So interesting in our modern secular world that our calendars still reflect the enduring legacy of Jesus Christ, both at Christmas and now at Easter. Everybody has Good Friday off. We still are dramatically affected by the week that changed the world. And so this is what we're looking at just this week. It's a week-long series this weekend and next weekend on Easter, looking through the Gospel of Luke and Luke's account of the triumphal entry, or Palm Sunday, as it's called in church history. Good Friday, we're looking at Luke's account of the death of Jesus. And then next week, looking at these disciples' experience of the resurrected Jesus for Easter Sunday. It's going to be fantastic. On April 8th, 2007, normal-looking guy, baseball hat, t-shirt, jeans, walks into a Washington, D.C. subway station. He opens up his violin case, he brings out the violin, and he plays 6 songs on his violin. 1,097 people walked by as he played these 6 songs. As people walked by, they dropped money in his violin case, totaling $32.17. One of those people who walked by stopped and listened to this person play the violin. What these people didn't know, these 1,097 people, what they didn't know was that this was actually an experiment hosted by the Washington Post, facilitated by the Washington Post. Because the person playing the violin, his name was Joshua Bell. And Joshua Bell is a world-renowned classical musician. Just days before playing in this Washington, D.C. subway station, he sold out a hall with a Boston Symphony where people paid hundreds of dollars per ticket to listen to him play. What these people didn't know as they were walking by Joshua Bell was that the violin he was playing was worth $3.5 million. 1,097 people walked by, and one person stopped. One person stopped to experience the magnificence of what was happening. And so many people walked by and missed it. My friends, this is the narrative that we get to experience in Luke chapter 19, in the triumphal entry, as Jesus, who is the most magnificent, is riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. It's easy to miss, and so let's not miss it as we move into the week that changed the world. We're going to see these three different things. Luke chapter 19, we'd love for you to get your Bibles. Jesus is king, Jesus is worshiped, and he is rejected. Verse 28 to 25, we're going to see what Luke is doing is he's convincing us that Jesus is the king. So let's get into it here in Luke chapter 19. Here is what it says. One second. There we go. Here's what it says. After Jesus had said this, he just told a parable, okay? He's walking to Jerusalem. He went on ahead going up to Jerusalem, Now, this is something for us. We're like, yeah, setting the stage. Let's move on. But I don't want to move on too quickly because it's so important for us to be reminded again of how accurate and how trustworthy these documents actually are. So oftentimes we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, we look at the Bible, it's like, this old ancient document. It's about myths and stories and fairy tales, and none of it actually happened. We can't trust any of it. And so we look at it with a really skeptical lens. But what we miss is an important geographical detail that Luke is giving us. That as Jesus had said this, he went on ahead going up to Jerusalem. Well, where had Jesus been? Luke chapter 19 starts with Jesus in Jericho meeting a guy named Zacchaeus. Now, here's a topographical map of what Jesus has just done. Luke chapter 19 starts with Jesus here in Jericho meeting our good friend Zacchaeus. He then walks this ancient road up to the Mount of Olives up here. This was about a kilometer going up to Jerusalem. Jericho is the lowest city on earth. It's minus 800 feet sea level. He walks all the way up to the Mount of Olives, or in this area. Luke here is accurately describing this journey. He is going up to Jerusalem. Now, there's a guy named Peter Williams. He is a PhD-trained theologian, expert in ancient Greek, expert in these documents that we're looking at, these synoptic gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life. He wrote a fascinating book a few years ago called Can We Trust the Gospels? And here is what Williams says about hints and clues and pieces of information like this that the gospel writers give us. Here's what he says. All four gospels know that traveling to Jerusalem, the elevation there, is correctly described as going up. This is what Luke just gave us. Mark and Luke know that leaving Jerusalem is correctly described as what? Going down. So it's going down or going up. He goes on. Jericho is, in fact, the lowest city on earth, over 250 meters below sea level. Going from Jerusalem to Jericho involves a descent of approximately 1 kilometer, or in this case, an ascent of 1 kilometer. Here's the point. My argument, he says, is not that knowledge of these geographical details demonstrates the Gospels to be true. That's not what I'm saying. It's not like, okay, these are, of course these are true. No. What Williams is saying is that rather the idea that these writers, the gospel writers, got the story wrong for lack of high quality information on the location events is false. In other words, they had good information because all of the geography, not just with the topographical journey of Jericho to Jerusalem, but a lot of other things that these gospel writers give us are all accurate. Then he says, either the gospel writers themselves or people they interacted with at length were able to describe the locations of Jesus' activities in detail. In other words, what he's saying, the people who were giving these gospel writers the information knew exactly what was going on. Then he says, to put this more positively, the gospels are not merely accurate in their geography when compared to other sources, they are themselves valuable geographical sources. So if you just approach the gospel writers, not from a spiritual lens, and you are looking simply for geographical information about mountains and different places and cities and regions, what Williams says is that they are very, very, very good sources of information that we can have. And I think that's really helpful for us as we approach these documents to know that they are actually really, really helpful in understanding the ancient world. Okay. Kind of an aside, but I think it's really interesting and really good for us to be aware of. So he says, as he approached Bethpage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives. Where's that? The hill called the Mount of Olives. From this mountain, you actually look to the temple here in Jerusalem. You look across the Kidron Valley, and he talks about that. He sent two of his disciples, saying to them, go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt there which no one has ever ridden. Now, this is an important detail. This whole passage is saturated with Old Testament imagery and facts. The whole thing, if you will not understand it if you don't get what is happening. And this is a reference to Deuteronomy chapter 21. Then he says, untie this colt and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you untying it? Say, the Lord needs it. Those who were sent ahead went and found it just as he had told them. As they were untying the colt, its owners asked them, why are you untying the colt? They replied, the Lord needs it. They brought it to Jesus, threw their cloaks on the colt, and put Jesus on it. Now, if you are new to church, like if you're a church person, like, I know this story, it's about a donkey in it. But if you're new to church, you're like, what in the world is going on? Jesus, walking into Jerusalem the last week of his life, sends two disciples ahead of him. He's at the Mount of Olives. He says, hey, you're going to go find a donkey. When you find this donkey, untie it, bring it to me. When the people ask, why are you untying it? Say, the Lord needs it. So that's exactly what happens. These two disciples say, well, okay, I'm the disciple. My master, my rabbi told me to walk ahead. So they walk ahead. They find the colt there. They untie it. The owner's like, hey, what are you doing? They're like, oh, well, the Lord needs it. They're like, oh, gotcha. Then they bring the donkey back to Jesus. They throw their cloaks on it. Jesus sits on the donkey. Like, what? Why is this in the Bible? What is happening here? What's happening here is very interesting for us to unpack a little bit. Now, whether Jesus pre-planned this event, that's possible. The other option is that Jesus, being God, just prophesies and brings these events into action. Whether he pre-planned it or whether he just foretold it, we're not sure. But what is for sure is what is happening here is a reference again to the Old Testament. This is a reference to the Old Testament book of Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9. Because this is the fulfillment of what was prophesied and talked about 5 centuries before this moment. So let's look at now Zechariah 9:9. Here is what it says. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. Zion is another fancy word for Jerusalem. This is the city of God. This is the city that Jesus is walking into. So it's addressed to the people of Jerusalem. See, look at this. Your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. What's going on here in its original context is that Zechariah is encouraging the nation of Israel and the city of Jerusalem and its inhabitants that one day, a future king will walk into this city on a donkey, and he is going to lead a campaign against all of Israel's enemies and will be the conqueror. Your king, the true king, is coming into our city, and he's going to lead us into victory. That is what Jesus here is doing. So Jesus here is acting as his own PR guy, right? Because he knows this reference. And as he either prearranged or foretold these events, what's going on is this happening in action. And the people of Jerusalem knew of this background, that the king is going to come righteous and victorious riding on a donkey. Without understanding Zechariah 9, this is like the strangest thing you'd ever hear. But this is what Luke is doing. He's showing to us that Jesus is the king. Jesus is a long-awaited king that will lead this campaign against Israel's enemy. Not the enemies they think, but against Satan, sin, evil itself, and death itself. So, what this is the grand unveiling of Jesus Christ as king. This is what Luke is doing for us. He's showing us Jesus's coronation. So, the king, King Charles, the new king, There's a whole bunch of news right now about his coronation, and they want it a little bit different, and there's going to be all these things. And really, the coronation is when literally the crown is put on the head of the new ruler. This is the grand unveiling of the true identity, the true person of the king. So that may be accessible to you. If you are a parent of young kids like me, and especially girls, this is also like Elsa's coronation day. But anyway, I won't get into all of that. But this is Luke telling us, here is who Jesus actually is. He is the king. Because all the way through Luke, from Luke chapter 9, verse 31, Luke chapter 9, 31, Luke says to this, and Jesus turned his face to Jerusalem and marched to it. This is a fulfillment of 10 chapters of Jesus marching towards this moment of who Jesus is. And Luke, all the way through his gospel, is through different people, different perspectives, different experiences. They're trying to figure out who is Jesus. And so here in Luke chapter 7, verses 19 and 20, John the Baptist sends his disciples to Jesus and they ask, "Are you the one? Are you the one who is coming?" In Luke 7, a Pharisee's guest asks, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Jesus just forgave the sin of an adulterous prostitute. And they ask, "Who is this even who forgives sins?" In Luke 8:25, the disciples ask after Jesus calms the wind and the waves, "Who is this commanding the wind and the waves?" In Luke 9:9, Herod Antipas, who says, "Who is this I hear such things about?" Who is this Jesus? Luke 9:18, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do the crowds say I am?" And they answer. And then in Luke 19:20, he asks Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" All the way through, there's this rumblings and whisperings and foretellings and understandings and trying to figure out who is Jesus. And in Luke 19, Luke shows us Jesus is the king. He's the king who 5 centuries before was prophesied to enter the city of Jerusalem as the one to lead a conquering mission against Israel's enemies. Jesus knew this, and in him, this prophecy, boom, comes alive. So who is Jesus? Well, it's a good question. Who is Jesus? Who's Jesus to you? Many, many different answers to that question. In the smorgasbord of ideas in our culture, hardly anybody would discount who Jesus is. Jesus is respected. People love his teachings. They love his example. But who is Jesus to you? See, what Luke is not allowing us to do, he is not allowing you and I to somehow dilute or decipher another title other than the fact that Jesus is king. But what kind of a king is he? He's an accessible king because this is a king who's riding on a donkey. He's riding on a donkey. A few years ago, I was in Riverside Park with my kids, and there's RCMP members on horses, right? And it's super intimidating. Like, these horses are big and beautiful, and you look up at these RCMP members all decked out in their uniforms. They're very kind, but it is not an accessible image as you look up to these massive horses and these people on these horses. Jesus is on a donkey. Like, if you actually picture it, it's ridiculous. Like, donkeys are the most awkward. Nothing's respectable about them. But Jesus, as he's walking into the city on this donkey, people can look him in the eye. You see that? He's not all the way up there in this really intimidating place. People can look him in the eye. I think that's really key, that this king, he is the ruler of all, the one who spoke creation into existence, the second member of the Trinity who took on flesh and dwelt amongst us. He is transcendent. He is God. But my friends, he is also immanent. He is also close. He is not far away up there. He is close. And these people can look him in the eye. In one of the months of in 2017, Elon Musk, the founder of Tesla, the owner of Twitter, maybe a little bit more controversial these days than back then, but he accidentally shared his phone number to 17 million followers on Twitter. He thought he was just texting somebody, and actually he tweeted out, "Hey, can you get a hold of me? Here is my number." 17 million people saw Elon Musk's personal cell phone number. Accessible. There's something about that we want. That Jesus is transcendent, and yet he's also the king who is immanent. You can look him in the eye. What a beautiful picture that Jesus is king. Second, Jesus is worshiped. The response now to this Jesus, who is king, we see this in two different ways, a positive way and a negative way. Here's the verse 36. As he went along, so he's riding now on this donkey going into Jerusalem, people spread their cloaks on the road. They literally took off their outer garment and laid it on the road. All of these people, knowing what was going on, they put their cloaks on the road. And this was a sign of submission. A physical act of worship. If Jesus is king, the only thing that I can do in response to that is I literally take off my outer layer and I put it on the road so that he can walk on it. This was the red carpet, that this royal king on this royal animal is walking into the royal city. These people submit themselves to Jesus in worship. It says, when he came near the place where the road goes down to the Mount of Olives, remember where the road goes down to the Mount of Olives? We can see us here. He's going down this mountain now. Again, geography here. It goes on. The whole crowd of disciples began joyfully to praise God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. They lay out their outer garments as the red carpet, and then they just begin to sing. They begin to worship. They physically embody their love for Jesus and all he is and all he's done. That's their response. That these people, the only response to King Jesus is that they worship in submission and joy. And what they sing is this. They sing, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Now, this was what was talked about in Luke chapter 2, in the birth of Jesus. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest is the angel's announcement of Jesus' birth. And now these common people, they are not the rulers, they are not the people of influence. The common people, the angels said it at the birth, and now these common people say it as Jesus is walking to his death. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. But here's what they say. Blessed is the King. These people knew Zechariah 9:9. This is the King that was foretold. And they sing this Psalm 118, verse 26. Psalm 18, verse 126. This psalm says this. Here's Psalm 118. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. From the house of the Lord, we bless you. This was what we would call a conquering psalm. This was a psalm that was sung by these pilgrims as they go to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. This was a song that was sung all the time in this moment. What they do, though, and what Luke does, is he adds in this king moniker, this king title. Why? Because what Luke is doing is again showing us that Zechariah 9:9 is being fulfilled, that Jesus is the king, and so they sing this Old Testament psalm, blessed is he. And so these people knew that Jesus was the king. So often when we think of the triumphal entry of Palm Sunday, we just look at the humility of Jesus, this donkey. And there's something about that, absolutely. But what they don't say, what these people don't sing is, blessed is the lowly, humble Jesus riding in on the donkey. They're not saying it. They're saying, blessed is the King, because they know who he is. And they worship him with their voices. That's all they can do. And they physically give something in response. What Zechariah 9:9 does not foretell is how Jesus would actually lead a campaign against Israel's enemies. See, because the people here, they're thinking, oh, Jesus is going to be the one who's going to get rid of the Romans. He's going to get rid of the Romans for us, and he's going to bring them out of our land, and we can have our land back, and everything will be great. But what kind of a king is Jesus? Jesus is not the king they think him to be, because Jesus is the king who doesn't go into Jerusalem with a sword to fight on behalf of Israel against the Romans. No. What makes him a king is that this donkey is bringing him not to a throne, but to a cross. And this is why Jesus is worthy of your worship. Because Jesus is not coming with a sword. He's not coming with us or to us in that way. He's coming to give himself for us, to sacrifice himself in our stead. And this, my friends, this is why we worship Jesus. This is why we physically embody our praise. This is why we physically do something, because Jesus has come not to rescue us from these outer things, but to rescue us this Easter from Satan, sin, hell, and death, and the effects of this broken world on our addictions and our family and our relationships, on the negative scripts we play, on all of the evil and all of the destruction, that Jesus has come to free us from all of this. And this is why we worship. The response, the proper response to the King who will sacrifice himself for you is worship. And worship is just a demonstration of your loves. And so as Christians, we worship. Like your whole life is worship. We worship when we come into this room together and we lift up our hands. Jesus, come. We love you. We worship when we talk about finances and it's like, hey, how do I physically embody my love for Jesus? You give, you trust Jesus with everything you are, including your finances. We trust Jesus with our sexuality and our desires. We trust Jesus with our future. We physically embody our faith and love. And this is the response needed to Jesus. But it's not the only response. So these people, praising, all of the red carpet pulled out for Jesus. They're praising him, worshiping him, but not everybody is. Here's what it says. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd, so some people were there watching this scene, in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." Why? Why do they want them rebuked? Because they know Zechariah 9:9 too. They know what's going on here. They know that they are ascribing this kingship to Jesus. And so these Pharisees, the religious power brokers of the day, instead of worshiping physically by singing and submitting, they say, rebuke your disciples. Jesus, rebuke them. Make them stop. So instead of worshiping Jesus, these Pharisees worship themselves. Because Jesus to them is not somebody worthy to be worshiped. Jesus to them is a threat. That this Jesus is a threat to their security and their power and their self-determination. So instead of worshiping, they actually end up worshiping themselves. Teacher, rebuke your disciples. The negative response to Jesus by the Pharisees shows who they actually worship. They're afraid of losing all that they have, and so instead of worshiping Jesus, they worship themselves. And my friends, this is what worship is. Sometimes when we say the word worship, if you're new to church, it's like, oh, that's a religious thing. No, everybody worships something. Everybody, listen to me, submits themselves to something. And here we say, you will either submit yourself to Jesus or you'll submit yourself to yourself. You submit to yourself, just your own desires, your own life, your own flourishing, your own. And here we see that worship is innate. It is what we do. So the question isn't what you will submit to. The question isn't if you will submit. The question is what you will submit to. And your worship, what you submit yourself to, will either lead you to life and flourishing or to decay and destruction. Worship money right now? Oh, what a terrible time to submit yourself to money. What a terrible time. Recession, Bank of Canada, interest rates. Man, if you submit yourself to your portfolio and that's your love, watch out. You submit yourselves to your kids, well, get ready for a roller coaster as they do well or they don't do well. You are riding that. It'll either lead to life and flourishing or decay and destruction. Submit yourselves to experience of just life and travel and ease. Well, you're always going to be wondering, what am I missing? What's the next big experience that I can have? And it will never be enough. But for those who worship Jesus, who submit themselves, it doesn't lead to decay and destruction and diminishing returns. It leads to flourishing and joy. They joyfully sing, "Blessed is him." And this is the worship due to King Jesus. Now, lastly, Jesus is rejected. Verse 41 to 44. So imagine this scene. Jesus on a donkey. Some of the Pharisees, rebuke your disciples, right? Jesus, if they don't worship, the rocks are going to cry out because this is who I am, right? Now, he's riding in and he sees the city of Jerusalem. And here's what happens. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, an inner contentment, a joy, a shalom, but now it is hidden from your eyes. Jesus, as he's on this donkey and people are praising, he's riding in on this red carpet of people's cloaks, he's weeping. Look at that in your mind's eye. View that. He is weeping as he's walking down the Kidron Valley up to Jerusalem. He's weeping over the city. Why? He's not weeping because of what's coming. He does weep over his death. That's in Gethsemane, and he's working through all of that. That's to come. But his tears here are because he knows that as he goes to the city of God, Jerusalem, that he is going to be rejected. Like the Pharisees just rejected him, rebuke your disciples. He knows that the Jewish leaders and the Roman leaders are going to reject him. He knows that he is going to hang on a cross as he is mocked, ridiculed, and destroyed physically by these people. So he knows what's going to happen, and he weeps over it. My friends, here you see the heart of God over people and for people who reject him. He's weeping. In other words, there's not benign indifference to Jesus when people say no to him. He's not like, oh, move on. I don't care. Move on. No, there's weeping. His cheeks are wet from tears as he thinks about the people who look and pass him by, who don't stop, who don't worship. His response is tears. And this is the difference between thinking about sin and rejection of Jesus as just breaking a rule or breaking his heart. Do you understand that? Oftentimes when we disobey, when we don't worship, we're like, it's just like breaking a rule. It's like going 63 in a 60 zone. It's fine. Because what we think it is, it's just this breaking or transgressing of a law. There's no personality. There's no heart to it. But here Jesus is saying, no. He shows that he's weeping over the rejection that people will give to him. That is not breaking, your rejection of Jesus is not breaking a rule. It's actually breaking his heart. And he says this, the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and circle you on every side. He's talking here about peace. What will bring you peace? Why is he weeping? He's weeping over these people because what they actually need, they won't get. Ironically, this city, Jerusalem, literally means the city of peace in Hebrew. And so there's an irony here that Luke is pointing out that as Jesus is the Prince of Peace, going to the city of peace, they're not going to get it. They're going to reject him. They're going to murder him. So Jesus is weeping over the lost opportunity for these people to know him and to find what they're looking for. It'd be the same for parents who watch their children make decisions that lead to their destruction and they are unable to change anything. It's not benign indifference. It's the breaking of your heart. And we see here, what is Jesus' response or God's response to people's rejection of him? It is weeping over it. But there's also judgment. There's weeping and there's judgment. Because here's what Jesus says. To these people, to Jerusalem, who will reject him, to the Jews who will reject him, the days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and your children within your walls. And what he is talking about is the upcoming siege of 70 AD. He's saying this probably around 30 to 33 AD. He is predicting the fall of Jerusalem. And this is exactly what happens in 70 AD. The Romans say, forget it, we're coming. And this is what they do. And they topple the rocks, they topple the towers, people die. And Jesus is saying, your rejection of me will lead to this judgment. He says, They will not leave one stone on another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. You didn't show up when I came to visit. The invitation was there and you said no. So what's God's heart to those who reject? The first thing, and so important for us to know, is that there is weeping over people who reject. And there's also judgment. There's also, you had the opportunity, you knew, and yet you didn't show up. You did not respond. So for us, it's hard. I mean, this is hard. It'd be way easier to be like, oh, worship him and everything's great and he weeps over you who reject him and then end. No, but that's not how it ends. Because Jesus talks about judgment. And so it's like, for us, it's like, is this a bait and switch? There's mercy and weeping and there's judgment. No. I want it to be just the nice weeping, but no. We cannot parse out God's attributes, that he is both merciful and weeping, and he is just, holy, and will bring judgment. And this is the outcome. If you worship self and your priorities and your flourishing apart from God, that will lead to decay and destruction. There's a natural judgment that comes. But if you submit yourself to Jesus, there's joy and flourishing. And Jesus simply is saying this: I've come to bring you peace. Won't you accept? Don't walk by, but stay and marvel and worship. And so what? Firstly, Jesus redefines power. Think about that. In our culture, we're very skeptical of people with power, institutions, leaders, celebrities. We're very skeptical because they abuse their power. They use it for their own gain. But Jesus here redefines power because he is the king, not far up on a huge horse, but on a donkey. He is the king, the one worthy of all royal treatment, who's forgotten by the elite in his coming to Jerusalem. It's the common people who worship. And he's not going to a throne. Where's he going? He's going to a cross. This is the king who self-sacrifices for other people. And in so doing, Jesus redefines power. He is the king, and yet he is accessible to us. And some of us look at God and we say, man, God would never be able to look at me. There's no way, based on how I've lived, that God would ever be able to be in relationship or even care about me. You say, man, if God knew what I've done, where I've been, what I've said, there's no way. Some of us say, man, I've wandered too far. It's too far to go back. I'm de-churched. I left this thing long ago. I'm interested, but there's no way that God would accept me after I have left. Some say, man, I'm way too far gone. There's no way. No. The triumphal entry reminds us this is the king who is close. You can look at him, and he invites it. Secondly, Jesus challenges our false loves. The triumphal entry is a story about worship. Praise is the anthem of the day, and Luke is asking you, will you join in? Will you join in physically embodying your love for Jesus? What's your response to the king? Benign? Indifference? Just, whatever. It's for other people, it's not for me. There's a negative response in the Pharisees. No. Rebuke your disciples. Stop this. Because Jesus is a threat to their independence. Where are you at? See, Jesus challenges our false loves. He's asking you today by his Spirit, if you would listen, do you actually love Jesus Christ? If so, how does that represent in your life? How does that show up? What does it look like? And then finally, Jesus reveals the heart of God. As he approaches Jerusalem, he weeps over the people who say, forget it. crucify him. He weeps over those people, man. That's helpful for some of us who weep over friends and family and kids who've left the faith. It shows the heart of God. He weeps. He weeps because the peace that they search for, they will never find apart from Jesus. And he also reveals the heart of God in judgment. That as the king, he is not somebody that we can just snuff off without any consequence, but rather there is consequence for those who worship self instead of submitting to Jesus. My friends, this is the week that changed the world. Would you pay attention? Don't be the people that walk by as they did in the Washington train station. Be the one who sits and marvels at King Jesus. So Lord, meet us where we're at. We thank you for this beautiful image that you are accessible to us. Lord, I pray by faith people would reach out. They'd reflect. Lord, and in response, we would submit. We would worship, embody our love for you. So meet my friends wherever they are, where they're at today. Prepare our hearts, Lord, for Good Friday, as this week started the events that would lead Jesus to your death. And finally, and triumphantly, your resurrection. Be with us. Guide us, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week, Easter weekend. Bye-bye.